So is this like a first time for this show? You know, just talking about one project and the rest is historical context in this one part? I mean, I didn't hear you do this before, but it's just... Oh! After The Muppet Show, Jim Henson's career and the popularity of the Muppets kept getting bigger and better. Even without their beloved series, Kermit and the Gang kept on going strong with 2 more movies and a handful of specials to continue their reputation as a dominant force on the big and small screen. However, their fame reached a whole new level when they teamed up with Marvel to turn a musical sequence from The Muppets Take Manhattan into the animated phenomenon we know today as Muppet Babies, which not only kept Muppet Mania alive in an unexpectedly different way, but also provided Henson with a new additional merchandising juggernaut to help finance his company and his more ambitious projects. Speaking of the latter, Jim was simultaneously expanding his creativity and his capabilities as an entertainer. He decided to create new worlds beyond the Muppets, and they went on to have an entire life of their own with The Dark Crystal and Fraggle Rock. So by the mid-1980s, Jim was at the top of his game with 3 massively successful series such as Muppet Babies, Fraggle Rock, and Sesame Street, having several hit movies under his belt, and the Muppets themselves were still some of the biggest entertainment icons. And yet, as great as it was to see Jim Henson at the peak of his career, it all came with a critical catch. After he reached the top, that was when his world falls down. Soon after the release of The Dark Crystal, Jim Henson and illustrator Brian Froud agreed to work on another fantasy movie. This time, however, instead of going heavy with its dark tone, they decided to make the film a little more lighthearted, based on what Jim felt that might not have worked with Crystal for critics and moviegoers. It would still incorporate Froud's intricate fantastical designs and have more human actors to interact with the puppets, but the characters would have a bit more of a Muppety personality to make the viewing experience more fun. As for the story, Froud envisioned a baby surrounded by goblins who kidnapped them, and in order to rescue the child, the protagonist would have to go through a massive maze, which could also serve as, in the words of Froud, a metaphor for the soul's journey. For the next few years, Henson grew a whole team to help develop the story of this labyrinth movie at different parts of the production, which included Jim himself and Froud, Fraggle Rock songwriter and Canadian poet Dennis Lee, Monty Python member Terry Jones, Fraggle Rock writer Laura Phillips, screenwriter Elaine May, and Jim's movie-making friend George Lucas, who came on board to the picture as an executive producer and creative consultant. The script went through numerous of treatments in order to find the right tone and the right direction for the story and characters, especially with the Goblin King Jareth, whom Jim casted David Bowie after he was influenced by his son John to do so. As the movie was slowly but surely coming to life, no one was more anticipated for Labyrinth than Henson himself. Even if he was still hopping around his many other projects at the time, this was his biggest deal for him as not just his second big-budgeted non-Muppet movie, but his first as a solo director. In fact, in the weeks up to its premiere, Jim spent a lot of time excitingly trying to promote the picture. However, when Labyrinth was released in theaters on June 27, 1986, it didn't turn out to be the way that Henson expected. In fact, for him, it couldn't have been worse.
It's not fair!
That's right, it's not fair. But that's only half of it.
Yeah, it was not a good time for Jim. Critics were very mixed with the writing, the acting, the family-friendly tone, and the main character, Sarah, but it was unanimously agreed that Labyrinth was weaker than The Dark Crystal. As for how the public felt, despite the newly original fantasy world that Henson and his team developed for years, it wasn't enough to grab people's attention to go see it. only making over half of its $25 million budget at the box office, domestically by the way, and making a worldwide total of $34 million. So not only was it a critical failure, but a financial one too, which really took a toll on Jim. For the first time in a very long time after producing hit after hit, Jim Henson had his first taste of failure, and it put him in such a depressing mood that it made him hesitant to work on any other feature for the rest of his life. Sure, his vision of how people would react to Labyrinth didn't happen until decades later, as the movie is now considered a cult favorite, but Henson didn't live to see that happen. While the disappointment may have deterred Jim from making movies again, it did not discourage his creativity. Even if critics weren't so kind to his non-Muppet movies, two things that they unanimously loved were the production designs and the technical side of the puppetry that the team created at Jim's workshop in London, the Jim Henson Creature Shop, which later moved to its current location in Burbank, California. He still wanted to give his more serious sense of storytelling and realistic puppets a go, but this time, he carried that vision onto his next big project that brought him back to the medium he mastered, television. The concept of this show, called The Storyteller, was an anthology series that would tell lesser-known European folktales, featuring a host who is the titular storyteller, played by John Hurt, accompanied by his dog, performed by Brian Henson. The first episode, Hans My Hedgehog, premiered on NBC on January 31st, 1987, and after failing to impress critics with his movies like The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, they finally gave Jim the praise he was looking for. So much so that the episode went on to win an Emmy for Outstanding Children's Program. However, as rewarding to hear that Henson still got that creative magic, it did not last long. The Storyteller went on to only have a total of 9 episodes because the series was getting too expensive to produce and gave very little in return. Only 4 of them managed to air as their own special, while one called The Three Ravens didn't get a chance to air until 1997 on HBO. There was a spin-off series that focused more on Greek myths in 1991, but that never got to air in the US at the time, and only 4 episodes were ever produced.
I thought, what will I do when there are no more stories in me? When the well runs dry? What use a storyteller without stories?
Around the same time as The Storyteller's debut, due to some problems with Jim's relationship with HBO, Fraggle Rock ended its longtime run with 96 episodes across 5 seasons. They tried to keep the show alive several months later with an animated series by the makers of Muppet Babies, but that was very short-lived with only 13 episodes produced. Meanwhile, as that was simultaneously happening, the Muppets were spending time honoring their creator. They already had a special doing so a year prior called The Muppets: A Celebration of 30 Years, where all the Muppets from The Muppet Show, Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, Sam and Friends, Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas, Little Muppet Monsters, and more come together in a formal banquet, presenting their history in film and television.
We come together tonight to pay tribute to our beloved flippered friend.
Oh, come on, Fozzie.
No, Kermit, you deserve it. I mean, you're the one who started it all.
At the end of 1987, all those Muppets reunited again for a little tribute as part of Jim Henson being inducted into the Television Academy Hall of Fame and for the ABC holiday special, A Muppet Family Christmas, where they all spend the holidays together at Fozzie's mom's house. By that point, when The Storyteller wasn't getting the traction that Henson hoped for, he was proposed an idea that instead of having The Storyteller be its own thing, it could be a part of something bigger that would present the talents of both Jim and his team, along with getting some extra help from Kermit and his friends. After many years of giving the Muppets the spotlight, it was time for Jim to be the star of his own show with the Jim Henson Hour. The series is a showcase of what Henson's creations can do. Usually, Jim himself would introduce the program alongside the Thought Lion, and the show would be split into 2 segments. The first, called Muppet Television, continues the tradition of the Muppet Show in a new way, where Kermit the Frog and the gang is running their own TV network and put out content that feature musical numbers, comedy sketches, and special guests, while the second featured a half-hour special, rather it be something with the Muppets, an episode of The Storyteller, or something original. The idea for the series came from looking upon another entertainment innovator, Walt Disney. During his anthology series, which went through different names like Disneyland, Walt Disney Presents, and The Wonderful World of Color, Walt himself appeared as the host to present what his team at his company were capable of doing, rather it be showing clips of his cartoons and movies, new content for television, or a behind-the-scenes look at upcoming films and projects for his theme park. And in 1986, the show was revived on ABC, hosted by their latest CEO.
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner.
For Henson, this format feels perfect to not only get more people to watch The Storyteller, but to also give a spotlight to his team and to experiment with new technology that could innovate the medium of puppetry such as computer graphics. Originally, Jim wanted to have a 4-week plan for the Jim Henson Hour that would go on rotation to showcase a specific theme for each week. The first week would have an episode of The Storyteller. The second would have a new program called Lead-Free TV. Before the hour, Jim thought about a concept and built a pilot for a show called Inner Tube, where in every episode, a guest star gets sucked into the TV and has to go through a bunch of content that satirized TV channels. However, since no one wanted to buy it, he reshaped it into Lead-Free TV, where it sticks closer to the Muppet Show formula, even having characters like Kermit be featured, but still retained that satirical side to comment on how television was at the time. The third week would show something called a picture book special, which was some of Henson's more light-hearted productions, such as Emmett Otter's Jug Band Christmas and 1986 The Tale of the Bunny Picnic. And finally, the fourth week would be literally anything Jim would think of. Whatever miscellaneous project that was on his mind or a chance to give audiences a behind-the-scenes look would be reserved for that spot. With the help of NBC and its head of programming, Brandon Tartikoff, Jim was able to create a pitch, and by the end of 1987, it paid off as Tartikoff and the network accepted to produce half a season's worth of the show. However, this deal came with a major catch. Instead of Jim's 4-week rotation plan, Tartikoff suggested to have all of those ideas on every episode, where the first half would have the lead-free TV concept of Muppet-like skits, while the second half would be reserved for specials or storyteller episodes. Of course, Henson agreed to bring the show to life, but even then, he knew that making it their way would be extremely difficult. And as he began to work on his new show in 1988, the year would prove to be one of his most challenging. Not only did he have to figure out how to integrate all of those big ideas into a weekly hour-long series with the help of writers Jerry Jewell, Larry Milken, and Jocelyn Stevenson, but he was also working on the first film adaptation of The Witches, which was an entire nightmare in itself by dealing with the enraging demands of the ill-tempered Roald Dahl, amongst other calamities during that production. On the other hand, it would be a lie to say that Jim and the gang didn't have a good time while making the show. During the Muppet segments, it was almost like old times when they were making the Muppet Show, where they weren't really working, but just having fun as a family and letting their imagination run wild. They had a small taste of that reunion in A Muppet Family Christmas, but this one was more special since they were making another show. Even Muppet veterans Frank Oz and Richard Hunt join in to provide some quick appearances of their famous Muppets like Beaker and Fozzie, despite becoming increasingly busy because of having a directing career or working on other Muppet projects respectively. At first, Jim was a little hesitant to actually get on camera to be the host, and once considered Kermit to take his place. But because the show was literally called The Jim Henson Hour, it was only fitting that the man himself would come in to introduce the program. The first time he tried it was a little awkward, and Jim didn't feel natural in the shots. So to fix that, director Peter Harris brought in the Thought Lion from the Storyteller episode True Bride as a companion for Henson to work with. There may not be a reason why they chose the Lion to be Jim's co-host, but it did make him feel more comfortable now that he got someone to talk to.
Are you ever going to talk on our show?
I doubt it.
Also, instead of a fictional Muppet workshop like he did in the pitch, Jim decided to have his background for the hosting segments be an elaborate CG set to give viewers a taste of that kind of future technology he wanted to play with. During the series' first half, the team evolved lead-free TV into Muppet television, as some popular Muppets like Kermit, Gonzo, and Link Hogthrob would remain among the cast, along with Bean Bunny making his debut as a Muppet member after he first appeared in The Tale of the Bunny Picnic. Many of the characters are new Muppets, most of whom only appeared in the Jim Henson Hour, designed by Michael K. Frith and a new member of the Henson team, Kirk Thatcher. These include Leon the Lizard and Clifford, both of whom were played by one of the newer Muppet performers, Kevin Clash, Waldo C. Graphic, the first computer-generated Muppet made at Pacific Data Images, Vicky, Kermit's new assistant, Lindbergh, Jacques Roach, the tech pirates of Guerrilla Television that consists of Zondra, Ubu, and Chip, and a new band called Solid Foam, featuring Digit, who is also the technical director, Clifford, Beard, Flash, and the drummer who never had a name. Also, as briefly mentioned before, some of the other Muppets from The Muppet Show made small appearances throughout the series.
You enjoying all this? I'll say, you don't have your hearing aid turned on. That's why I'm enjoying it.
As for the second half of the show, considering that this was where Jim could also produce whatever special he wanted, he thought about many potential ideas of what could fill that half hour. Some of them include a Fraggle Rock origin story called The Saga of Fraggle Rock, an adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time, Inside John, where parts of the brain try to control a 17-year-old kid on a regular day, and a concept that would blend puppetry with animation, video effects, and CG called Astronewts. Ultimately, none of them ever happened. And outside of the Storyteller episodes, the second half in the Jim Henson Hour included original specials like Lighthouse Island and the Song on the Cloud Forest, and specials that feature familiar Muppets like Miss Piggy's Hollywood and Dog City, narrated by Rolf.
Well, this is it. Dog City, where the dogs are raining and the cats are nervous.
On a side note, Dog City turned out to be one of the most beloved elements from the Jim Henson Hour, that it went on to have its own animated spin-off series in 1992 that ran for 3 seasons with 31 episodes. But back onto the main topic, there were a handful of episodes that did stick to Jim's original vision of the show, and have one special take over the entire hour, including Monster Maker, based on the Nicholas Fisk novel, Secrets of the Muppets, which showed how Jim Henson's shows and movies were made, and an original story called Living with Dinosaurs. There was also Sesame Street 20 Years and Still Counting that Jim always planned to be part of the series, but that went on to be its own special that aired a week before the show's premiere. However, a few elements do hint out that 20 Years and Still Counting is a Jim Henson Hour episode, including the same closing credits and an introduction by Jim Henson himself alongside Kermit.
But here we are 20 years later, and Sesame Street is still going strong. 20 years? Yes, 20 years. Woo!
When the Jim Henson Hour premiered on April 14th, 1989 with the episode Outer Space, which featured guest star Louis Anderson, and the Storyteller episode The Heartless Giant, critics agreed that the series was a major mixed bag. Just like the Storyteller, the second half of the series was widely praised and were unanimously agreed to be the best parts of the show. In fact, Jim even won an Emmy for his directing work on Dog City. However, when it came to the first half with Muppet Television, most agreed that it was awful. Even if Jim knew that those segments weren't his best work, that didn't stop the critics from saying that the show would have been much better if they cut out the first half completely to let the second half be the whole show. But these criticisms cut deeper when looking closely at what they were slamming. Those segments weren't just any project that came from the mind of Jim Henson. They were the segments that featured the Muppets, what was supposed to be the next generation of the Muppet Show. It was something that featured Kermit the Frog and the Muppet signature wackiness that everyone knows and loves. Yet critics still called it the lame parts of Saturday Night Live scaled down for kids, and that it's trying too hard to be hip is a heartbreaking wake-up call that the Muppets are not always a guaranteed hit. And what's worse, the ratings were even harsher, where every episode gave what was possibly the worst ratings that Jim ever received. It didn't take too long for NBC to just give up on the series and cancel the Jim Henson Hour halfway into its run. The final episode that aired on the station was on July 30th of that same year, with what some consider to be a painfully fitting title, Garbage.
Oh, that's a load of garbage. Or actually, I'm a load of garbage.
That's for sure.
And yet, not all the episodes produced aired on ABC. Some, like Secrets of the Muppets and Living with Dinosaurs, had to wait a few years later when Nickelodeon presented them as standalone specials in 1992 and 1993 respectively, and the last episode, titled Food, never got to air in the US. Following afterwards, reruns of the Jim Henson Hour did air on TV, but never in the same way as it originally did on NBC. All the episodes were split in two, where the second half of them were shown as their own specials or their own storyteller episodes, while also getting their own home media release, while the Muppet television segments aired in Canada on the channel CTS and were edited to remove any mention of a second half to turn it into the Jim Henson Show.
Almost all of us are excited. Anyhow, this program will give you a chance to see a lot of different things. It represents the very best of the work we've been doing lately. Now, our show is usually divided into 2 half hours. Almost all of us are excited. In fact, when I asked Kermit about it, he told me that I should really expect this show to be out there.
And before anyone asks, I hate to burst your bubble, but no. It's pretty much impossible to have the entire series on streaming because even the rights are all over the place. You see, everything that featured Kermit and his friends, like the Muppet television segments, Miss Piggy's Hollywood, and Secrets of the Muppets, all belong to Disney. Meanwhile, the rest, like most of the specials that showed in the second half, and the storyteller episodes, all belong to the Jim Henson Company. So, unless you're very lucky and you manage to find a VHS that just so happened to record the original NBC airings, or you dig really deep on the internet so that you would go and actually find those airings that someone went and uploaded them, there's honestly no way to go and watch the Jim Henson Hour the same way people did in 1989 in an official way. As Frank Oz described the series best, whatever Jim did, even some of the things that failed, there was always amazing stuff in it. But the Jim Henson Hour just didn't have the usual Jim focus. It was more like a grab bag of the brilliant things he's done. And that was exactly what caused the downfall of the Jim Henson Hour. Some could say it was NBC's fault due to their impatience or impossible demands. But the source of the problem was that Jim wanted to do everything in one series. He wanted to do another Muppet Show, more episodes of The Storyteller, a behind-the-scenes tour, telling new original stories, introduce new Muppets, and experiment with new technology. All of these are fantastic ideas on their own, but because Henson could only divide his attention to comply with what the network wanted of fitting them all into that 1 hour, most of them came out as a complete mess. And the biggest regret with this is that it wasn't just another failure for Henson similar to The Land of Gorch or Labyrinth. This was a failure for both Jim and the Muppets. An hour may seem like a lot of time, but it's actually not enough to do everything that you wanted. And Jim Henson himself had to learn that the hard way. If the failure of the Jim Henson Hour wasn't enough, there was another factor that increasingly became an issue for Jim. He was starting to get old. At 52 years old, going on 53, His long, flowing hair and beard was becoming gray, his body was becoming weaker as his pains were hindering his performances, he grew less patient with the business side of his career like management and financing, and he gathered newfound stress from dealing with failures like Labyrinth, The Storyteller, and The Jim Henson Hour. It was all becoming too much for Jim, and just like he did for his last show, he looked upon Walt Disney for guidance. However, instead of finding inspiration from the man himself and his hosting abilities, he was admiring the company's ability to make their characters immortal. The way that they keep Mickey Mouse and their versions of Snow White, Tinkerbell, and many more relevant as entertainment icons decades after the passing of Walt. And as Henson was grieving with his own mortality, he began to think about what would happen to Kermit and the rest of the Muppets after his passing. If they would continue to play the music and light the lights when Jim would be gone, then they would have to be left in the hands of a company who would both know how to maintain an intellectual property's legacy to keep them beloved and popular for generations to come, and provide high-quality entertainment that is worthy of the Muppets' reputation. And after consulting with his agent Bernie Brillstein and producer David Laser, instead of looking at Disney for guidance, Jim looked at Disney as his solution. And thus, Jim Henson called the mouse about officially selling the Muppets.
Hello, Mickey? Mickey, this is Kermit the Frog here.
The idea of selling his company to Disney was not a sporadic plan that he had at the moment. It was actually something that had always been on his head for several years. Going as far back as 1984, before he started work on Labyrinth, Jim was talking to the Walt Disney Company to either be the financier and distributor of Henson's next big projects, or just buy out Jim's company, Henson Associates, entirely. However, Disney passed because Henson Associates was not in the best shape, especially when Jim had yet to retrieve the rights to his properties like the Muppets and the Dark Crystal from Robert Holmes Accord. There were offers from other corporations, but Jim was confident that the only company that deserved the Muppets was Disney. But then in the spring of 1989, around the time when the Jim Henson Hour made its premiere, Henson was in talks with Disney's then CEO,
Hello, I'm Michael Eisner.
about selling Henson Associates. It was already off to a great start, since Eisner was the same man at ABC who greenlit the Muppet Show pilots back in the early 1970s, and had since climbed up the corporate ladder to become Disney's latest leader in 1984, alongside Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg, which required him to save the company from financially collapsing due to previous mismanagement and bring it back to its former glory like when Walt was running it. Just like he did in the 70s, Eisner loved the Muppets, and the opportunity to have them be a part of Disney felt like it would be perfect to help achieve the mission that he was hired to do. It also helped that Jim's company was in much better footing where, despite the recent flops, the rights to Jim's creations were all his, and his past works like The Muppet Show, Fraggle Rock, Muppet Babies, and more were still very profitable. At that point, it was the perfect match because Henson and Eisner knew at the time that both the Muppets and Disney needed each other. While Disney was slowly getting back into popularity thanks to Who Framed Roger Rabbit being their biggest success in years, The Little Mermaid was still several months away, and they were still not sure how it would ultimately turn out. So acquiring characters that had already established their popularity and strong reputation like the Muppets would be a great boost for the Disney brand, on top of receiving the rights to the Dark Crystal, Labyrinth, Fraggle Rock, and having one of the greatest creative visions in entertainment working for them. However, the only catch would be that they wouldn't get Sesame Street. Henson made it clear and made a promise to Joan Gans Cooney that those characters were off limits. As for the Muppets, on top of the $150 million he would receive, it would give Jim something that he always wanted but was getting less of it over the years: time for creativity. As the deal would put him in a 15-year exclusivity with the company where he could only make movies, TV shows, and theme park attractions for them, It would allow Disney to completely handle the business side that was giving Henson all that stress, while Jim could just set his focus on creating, including crafting original stories, getting more familiar with old characters like Kermit and new ones, checking his team at his workshops build new puppets, and fully explore new technology that could innovate the medium of puppetry. And so, after receiving a tour of Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida with Michael, Frank Wells, and Jeffrey Katzenberg, on August 28, 1989, Jim Henson and Michael Eisner went live on Good Morning America at their newly opened theme park, Disney MGM Studios, now called Disney Hollywood Studios, alongside meet and greet versions of Mickey and Minnie Mouse, Kermit, and Miss Piggy, to publicly announce that the Walt Disney Company was going to buy Henson Associates. Now, this may seem like the perfect happy ending that you'd find in a Disney movie. Like, Jim found the perfect new home for the Muppets, and they all lived happily ever after making new projects for Disney. Yeah, that's nice and all, but there's just one little detail that you need to keep in mind. They only announced that they were going to make the deal. They never said that the deal was done. In fact, the most that they did was a handshake and a signed agreement in principle, which is just an agreement that they would make an agreement. I mean, they would have finalized the deal sooner if it weren't for 3 problems that actually made the deal difficult. Problem number 1, Disney's lawyers and accountants. The original deal was that Jim would sell Henson Associates and most of its IPs to Disney for $150 million. However, the lawyers and accountants love to play hardball to lower the overall value, including the regular payment to Jim and the other performers. As you can imagine, it can get annoying real quick when they want to give you less of what was originally promised. Problem number 2, Jeffrey Katzenberg. Jeffrey is known for many things. Being polite is not one of them. During their meetings, Jim would be so put off by Jeffrey's disrespect to Henson's team and the art of puppetry that it caused him to sometimes second guess if he made the right move when the head of Walt Disney Studios was one of the biggest pricks in Hollywood. Even Eisner had to continuously apologize for Katzenberg's behavior to keep the relationship going. But hold on, don't think that Michael was one of the better parts of Disney, because he's actually problem number 3. Now, as much as he tried to clear the path to make this deal happen, he couldn't help himself but to keep on asking if Disney could also acquire Sesame Street, not just to own another batch of Muppets, but to also acquire its popular merchandising business. Kind of messed up that Eisner wanted a crucial element to the funds of a long-running PBS show. And yet, no matter how many times Jim said no, Michael still kept on asking in the hopes that the answer might magically change. Basically, Eisner was being that guy. You know, that guy who always seems nice, but can never stop asking his one female friend if they could be more than just friends, or if they could add some benefits to their friendship, despite never taking the hint that the answer is forever no. However, even with all of those problems, Jim still persisted throughout the troubles and followed Walt Disney's advice to keep moving forward. While the deal was not made official, Henson still had hope that it would end up becoming favorable for him, which was why during late 1989 and early 1990, he still worked for the company to connect the Muppets with Disney. The most ambitious connection they were conceptualizing was an entire Muppet-themed land in Disney MGM Studios, and the first project he worked on was the land's 3D film. By the way, I love to talk more about these, but I'm going to save all that theme park stuff for later. Let's just say that they deserve their own honorable spot.
Oh, that's right, I can't blink.
At the same time, Jim was also working on commercials, the Christmas parade where he performed as Kermit, and a TV special called The Muppets at Walt Disney World, which was meant to metaphorically initiate the collaboration between the Muppets and Disney that premiered on May 6, 1990.
Yeah, well, Mickey and I are old buddies.
I didn't know you knew Mickey Mouse.
Sure, we're both members of FASA.
FASA?
Yeah, Fictional Animal Stars of America.
Oh.
For Jim, what was supposed to be the answer to all of his problems gradually turned out to be both a blessing and a curse to his already hectic life. After going through a traumatic failure with the Jim Henson Hour, which put a stain on the Muppets' golden reputation, he looked upon Disney to help manage his problems and get some weight off of his back. And it came with varying results. Creatively, he was the happiest in years and was excited to explore opportunities to entertain people with the Muppets in whole new ways. However, when it came to doing business, it only made Jim's situation so much worse. With lawyers, accountants, and executives constantly demanding to have more of his legacy for less, it turned into a clash of corporate personalities that only gave him more frustration and stress. So much so that, despite never having a reputation of swearing, Jim often referred to it as that goddamn deal. But then everything changed on May 4th, 1990. Henson was a guest on the Arsenio Hall show and brought with him Kermit and Clifford. Earlier, he caught a cold that came with a bit of a sore throat, which hindered his performance during his time on the show.
She has a right that'll lay you right out. You know, it's just
an old piece of mosquito caught in your throat there.
Yes. I would have said I had a frog in my throat, but I won't say that.
Afterwards, he was disappointed with what happened, but he figured that it would eventually go away. However, he would later realize that what he got was much more than a common cold. In reality, Jim Henson had 12 days left to live. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this part, then don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll be honest though, the next part is going to start off very emotionally tough. But, on the bright side, it will pick up afterwards when we'll be looking into a beloved holiday classic. I know the start won't be fun, but it's a necessary moment to get through in our story. So, until next time, see you later, dudes.
Have you ever thought there must be life after death?
Every time I leave this theater.